Okay, so we're going to delve back into the issue of the virgin birth account. I've already discussed that the Ebionite Church, the founders were the 12 apostles led by James, and now we're in the second generation. We're into the late 100s, early 200s, and now they're having an issue where they've engaged Symmachus to translate for the world the Hebrew Matthew and to indicate that somebody had made a mistranslation of something in their gospel. Evidently, Isaiah 7, verse 14. They obviously must have been the Alma being translated as virgin, and then that person made up a story of a virgin birth account. It has to be, because that's what Eusebius is saying, in essence, is now a heresy. By 325, when he's writing, that's over 100 years later, 150 years later, than from when this originally occurs, and they have Symmachus helping them. So in 150 years' time, the everything had moved, principally due to Constantine, in a direction towards favoring the virgin birth now, and now the Ebionite are ending up getting suppressed in the 325 period. Anyway, but let's look at the evidence to prove that the virgin birth account was never in the gospel initially, and the clearest evidence starts with Mark 3. And so let me just read this to you, and I'm going to read it to you in the KJV. And we really only have to read the verses I've highlighted highlighted. So just to give you context, Jesus is on his first effort to get out and move and preach, and he's collected 12 men, and he's now going out and preaching. And then we're going to find out how his family reacts to this. Okay, so now it says when his family. That's how I should tell you. It did not say that in the King James. So let me just make sure you know that. It said when his friends. I think it was when his friends. And it's not friends. I'm having trouble with my computer here. Okay. When his friends, but it's family. Okay. So that's important. And this was mistranslated. And that's just one of the reasons why you don't see it. And you'll see there's no dispute at all about that, as you'll see. I'm going to show you. So when his family heard of it, they went out to lay hold on him, and they said he is beside himself. Basically, he's gone crazy. He's a madman. And that's why verse 31 and 32 directly relate to that. So in the interim, what happens is he's criticized inside the synagogue for basically, they claim he's a demoniac. His family is saying he's not a demoniac, he's just crazy. And verse 31, there came then his brethren and his mother, and standing without the synagogue, where all this is happening, sent unto him. So they've sent someone inside, go get him out, calling him. Okay, so he's asking, come out. They're asking, come out. These are the family members who've already dissed him and said he's beside himself. Then the multitude sat about him. So this is probably inside the synagogue. Got lots of people crushing around him. And they said unto him, behold, your mother and your brother without seek you. So they're outside and they want to see you. And he answered them, saying, who is my mother or my brethren? And he looked around about on them which sat about him and said, behold, my mother and brethren. So he is definitely dissing his mother and brethren outside, and that he's about the work of God. Last verse, for whosoever shall do the will of God, the same as my mother and my brother and my sister and my mother. So the KJV had friends. That's how it originally read. I changed it to family just so that we wouldn't get confused. The Geneva Bible, 1599, called it kinsfolk. Okay. So it's not friends, it's kinsfolk. And the KJV is also Calvinist. And so they were honest Calvinists, and they had it clear. The kinsfolk, they went out to lay hold on him, and they said he was beside himself. That was correct. 1599, but by 1615, I think people must have realized, how can you have Mary not being attached to Jesus and being as well as the rest of the family, and thinking he's crazy. So the only way you could dilute it is if you could change the word for kinsfolk there, but it's the kinsfolk. Vincent Word Studies, an expert in Greek, he says, okay, he always starts with the King James, and he says, it says friends there. Literally, though, he says, they who were from beside him, that is by origin or birth, his mother and brethren, and refers to verses 31 and 32. As I told you, it's not his disciples, since they were in the house with him. Okay, so we'll get into some of the other stuff in a minute. I just want to show you Gill's commentary points out that The very same passages were translated into the Syriac language and the Ethiopic language. Syriac is basically our Aramaic, and Ethiopic is Ethiopian, and the same word translation was made. That's Gil. You can look that up. And let's see what else here. So Ellicott, same thing. It means from him or from his home, meaning mother and brethren in this context. And okay, let's keep going. And then his own family, said to say, appeared in context to including his mother, to not think that they were trying to rescue their misguided kinsman, meaning Jesus, from danger. They're worried he might indulge his delusions without. They didn't want him to indulge his delusions and do harm to himself, so that's why they're going to grab him. Okay, so I think we've gotten the picture. Jesus is not being respected by his mother or his brothers, and he's basically says, as he teaches us, sometimes you'll find your enemies are inside your own home. So, and you can't love God more than your mother, brother, and father. So this is he lived through this issue, and he is telling us exactly how he deals with it. You've got to respect God more than your family in this instance. So I think we'll take a moment there to stop, and we're going to listen to Paul Williams, and he's going to explain the difference, though, in current Matthew and the current Luke. They were changed, okay? And I'm going to show you that Luke reads exactly as Mark did in 207 AD when Tertullian makes commentary on what has to be the Gospel of Luke. But here, Paul Williams is going to be telling you the current versions of both Matthew and Luke have gotten rid of verse 31. Excuse me, 21. The one about your family are here and they think you're going off the deep end. That verse is eliminated and then tones the whole thing down. You just have to remove that one verse and you've toned the whole thing down. So let's listen to what he has to say. It's a very astute observation.
So Matthew relies on Mark as one of his sources, but he clearly thought Mark was inadequate and complete, because sometimes Matthew paraphrases Mark, sometimes he deliberately alters Mark. And this shows us that for Matthew, the facts could be changed to enhance his message. A good example of this change is to note how Matthew improves the negative portrayal of Jesus' mother and brothers in Mark. In the latter, in Mark, they are shown as outsiders who think Jesus is mad, and they repeatedly fail to understand Jesus' message. Matthew, however, has a very different positive picture. Perhaps wanting to show the disciples as good role models for Christians, he is happy to change Mark's narrative to fit his viewpoint. He omits Mark's negative story where Mary and the brothers all try to restrain Jesus because they thought he was out of his mind. So it is clear that there has been some development in the way Mary is portrayed in the Gospels. In Matthew's Gospel, Mark's negative portrayal is eliminated. Luke, unlike Mark, also presents a highly positive portrait of Mary, and this is the gospel that Catholics often go to for their devotions and understanding when they're praying the rosary, for example. It's Luke's picture of a narrative of Mary that they focus and reflect on. In the scene parallel to Mark's, with the brothers in the house, she is now included in the eschatological family, those who hear the word of God and do it. Just look up Luke chapter 8, verse 19, 20 and 21. Luke, like Matthew, omits the embarrassing and offensive passage in Mark chapter 3, verse 20, 21.
Now, let me show you that Luke has the same view, is looking at the same type of wording. The family heard it. They went out to lay hold of him, and he is beside himself. They said he was beside himself. So that's the verse 21 that he was talking about, 2021. And also I think he meant to refer to 31. So the mother and brother are standing without, sent unto him. So that ties together what family we're talking about. So 21 and 31 together do that in Mark. So we're going to see the same thing has to be present in Luke, because otherwise it does not make sense. Hold on, let me get this for you. All right, we have a passage from a book called The Flesh of Christ by Tertullian, and in that book he says basically Mary is not attached to him anymore. So here it is. So this Tertullian lived between 155 and 220 A.D. Okay, so he's in that perfect time period where I'm saying it's in the latter half of the first century. Wait, no, second century, 100 to 199. Then you have the 200s, and he lives till 220. So he was very prolific, wrote lots of books, and he wrote a book called De Carne Christi in Greek, Greek and Latin, and it means on the flesh of Christ, probably around 207 AD, because he wrote against Marcion in the same time period, and the date on against Marcion is about 207 AD. You can get this at ccel.org, and we're going to look particularly at chapter 7, which even has in its title an explanation of the Lord's question about his mother and his brethren. So now you have to know why he's referring only to Luke and why he's even bringing this up. So let me first tell you why he's bringing it up. Because Marcion believes that Jesus is God or an angel, and he's not human. And therefore his flesh only looked human, but it really wasn't. So he really doesn't suffer any pain on the cross or any of these things. But Marcion doesn't seem to know about a virgin birth account because it's never discussed. Yet that would perfectly support his idea that Jesus was not born human. He was born God or an angel or something other than human. So in the Marcionite world, if Jesus was born human, he would be tainted by the filth of the flesh. So he has no flesh. He looks human, but he really isn't. So that's how he depicts Jesus. And so that's why Tertullian is going to say it's the flesh of Christ. That's the name of this book. And he's going to go against Marcion and prove he's wrong. Now, why do we know that Luke is only referring to the book of Luke? Why do we know that Tertullian is only looking at the book of Luke? Well, that's easy, because Marcion only uses the book of Luke and doesn't respect Matthew and doesn't respect John and doesn't respect anything but the book of Luke. And that could be because, remember, Marcion believes Paul is the only apostle. The other 12 are going to serve with Yahweh in Sheol, and they never resurrect. They stay in Sheol. Yahweh never goes back into heaven. He stays in Sheol. And what we have then is Jesus as God, or an angel who becomes God. It's hard to understand, but he's a God angel type figure. And then there is the good God. So you've got the good God, Jesus God, they're above, and they get to resurrect and take us with them. They have no right. There's no punishment for any wrong you ever do, and that's a wonderful life over there. But the people who were Jews or who thought they had to obey what Yahweh said, they're going to live in Sheol forever, in darkness and so on. It's not a pleasant place where they're going, but it's not like hell though. So don't feel too bad for them. That's kind of the Marcion picture of things. So anyway, let's listen to how Tertullian describes this argument. So how he's going to win the argument, he's going to have to try to prove that Jesus' mother and brothers don't respect him, and therefore he's very human. That's really the whole point. So, and he's going to use it. He's looking at verses exactly like Mark, and they're not like in Luke today. So Luke has been changed after this point in time. So this is a picture at the verses. And the only reason the Catholic Church didn't purge this is, I think, because he doesn't actually quote the verses. You have to use inference backward. You have to go, okay, would Tertullian say these things if the verses, as Luke reads today, were present? No, he couldn't say any of these things. So let's read this. So it's addressed. The heading is even addressed to Marcion. He's going to talk about Marcion. Okay, so now I'm just going to read you the highlighted green portions because there's a lot here. I went through it and I read, this is the whole full text of these portions of the book In the Flesh of Christ. His mother and brethren had turned up, but there's some ground for thinking that Christ's answer denies his mother and brethren for the present, as even Apelles might learn. The Lord's brethren had not yet believed in him. Okay, but most important we care about is the mother. Okay, next. So is it contained in the gospel which was published before Marcion's time? So he's trying to point to a gospel, and I think he's pointing at Luke for the reasons I've told you. The following: while there is at the same time a want of evidence of his mother's adherence to him. So wasn't there a gospel before Marcion even showed up that we can see and knew, all of us Christians knew, there was a want of adherence of his mother for him. And what the point is, his point is very clear. Marcion thinks Jesus is not human, didn't have a birth like the rest of us. He's just exists from forever. He's an angel. So he's saying, no, he had a real mother, and his mother didn't even respect him. I mean, so he's not like, like this God or angel living in their house. He's treated just like a regular son who can be in disagreement with his mother, who doesn't adhere to him, doesn't follow him. Although the Marthas and the other Marys were in constant attendance on him. So his mother is completely dissed him, is what he's saying. In this very passage, indeed, their unbelief is evident. The unbelief of the mother, Mary, and of the brothers. And that's true in Mark. Okay, you'd have to twist that word from family to friends, and that only the King James dared do that. Nobody else has ever dared to do that, because it's not true. It's not true. Jesus was teaching the way of life, preaching the kingdom of God, and actively engaged in healing body and soul, but all the while strangers were intent on him, his very nearest relatives were absent. So again, making the point, mother, brothers, they're not in his ministry. They're against him. By and by, they then keep outside. So in this story, same as in Mark, the family is staying outside. Okay, but that does not present itself as strongly in Luke. If we went there, you'd see these factors are not present in current Luke, but they're only present in what we can see today in Mark. Okay, let me keep going here. His family prefers to interrupt him. They wish to call him away from his great work. And then he basically says, Marcion, if you were in the same situation, wouldn't you exclaim, "What are mother and brothers to me?" If your family's treating you disrespectfully? Wouldn't you justly use the same form of words in order to strike the unbelief of those who stood outside, meaning Jesus's mother, brothers, and sisters? So he's defending Jesus' use of harsh terminology. Who is my mother? Who is my brother? Those who do the will of God, right? So he's defending that. And then basically he would shake off the opportunity of those the opportunity. I think it meant to say in some impropriety of those who would call him away from his work. So he was denying one's parents in indignation, but doing so doesn't mean he was denying their existence. So this is just to get back to the fact that they were his parents. He's not denying he was born a human being. He's just denying that they're disrespecting him and not wanting him to go out and do his ministry and somehow stay home and keep safe and you won't get harmed. Don't rock the boat is what his mom is trying to say. And then basically says Jesus points out in what sense he denied his mother and brother by saying he said he adopted as his own those who adhered to him, and in that did he deny as those who kept aloof. So he was adhering to those who were following the will of God, and he was denying those who kept aloof from him. Okay. And he also points out, the Tertullian does, Jesus was also teaching us not to esteem our mother or father or brothers as highly as the word of God. Okay, so you can see Jesus' own experience supports that. He went through this with his own family. He denied his parents, then in the sense in which he has taught us to deny ours for God's work. Okay, so I think you see the picture now. You cannot get away from the fact that Luke's gospel also, and that's the only one Tertullian would be using to argue with a heretic who only thinks Luke's gospel is the only valid gospel. And the reason, by the way, if I didn't mention it, is because Marcion believes Paul's the only apostle. The only gospel Marcion will trust is Luke's gospel, because he assumes Luke is writing as close as he can to his buddy Paul. And so that's probably why he's only using Luke's gospel. Okay, so I think that's enough there, and I want to stop, and I'm going to play another little clip from Paul Williams.
Verse 20-21. In a groundbreaking ecumenical study, a team of Roman Catholic, Anglican, and Protestant scholars collaborated in producing this agreed statement on Mary. It's called Mary in the New Testament. It's edited by some quite famous names, if you know New Testament studies: Raymond Brown, Joseph Fitzmyer, and others. And this was published some years ago, but I want to share with you their conclusions. So this is quite unusual. It has a Roman Catholic and Protestant and Anglican agreed statement on Mary. And historically, these churches have been literally at war with each other, but now they can come together and produce this agreed consensus on the New Testament's portrait of Mary. And they say, in Matthew's form of the passage in Mark, which we've seen, is not that different from Mark's, they say. However, it is not so much in the passage itself that Matthew differs from Mark, but in the context. The introductory scene in Mark chapter 3, verse 20-21, in which his own think he is beside himself, out of his mind, is completely absent. Presumably, they say, the omission was deliberate, and it can be understood if Matthew interpreted Mark's his own to include Jesus' mother. That's page 99 of the book. The study concludes with this assessment of the Synoptic Gospels' depiction of Mary. In other words, how Matthew, Mark, and Luke portray Mary, the mother of Jesus. We have spoken of a negative portrait of Mary in the Gospel of Mark. The principal text which leads to that conclusion is Mark 3:20-35. In Matthew and Luke's parallels to Mark, they give a rather different picture, largely by modification of the Marcan text. Both evangelists dropped the harsh introduction in Mark 3:20-21. Luke goes further in softening the Marcan picture by eliminating also the question of Jesus, who are my mother and brothers, and by transferring the Beelzebub controversy to another place entirely in Luke chapter 11. Thus, in the synoptic depiction of Mary during Jesus' ministry, we have a development from the negative estimation of Mark to the positive one of Luke, with Matthew representing the middle term. That's page 286 of this book.
Okay, so we're going to look at that book, and I want to read you the quote. I think he was alluding to this quote, and then I want you to see that they realize there's an issue with the virgin birth here. However, it is not so much in the passage itself that Matthew differs from Mark, but in the context. He read that. The introductory scene in which his own think he is beside himself is completely absent. So Matthew as modified, and so I believe it originally read the way it reads in Mark, but as modified, now that's gone. Verse 20, Mark 3, verse 21 is not any longer in Matthew or in Luke. Presumably, the omission was deliberate and can be understood if Matthew interpreted Mark's his own to include Jesus' mother. Okay, so they would deliberately remove it. Why? Because if he thought it could be understood to include Jesus' mother. Well, of course it included his mother, okay? In the logic of Matthew's gospel, Jesus' mother had virginally conceived her son. So they're referring to the virgin birth. So why is there tension here? Because if the mother is rejecting Jesus and doesn't believe in him, how could this woman have had a virgin birth account? So he's saying these theologians are all getting together and saying, well, Matthew couldn't have this account being so negative about Mary because he believes in a virgin birth. And none of them are asking themselves about the key question. Doesn't this tell you that textually somebody changed the verse and took out the very verse that you see in Mark and did it because somebody was adding a virgin birth account and needed to now remove verse Mark 3:21 in your Matthew and your Luke? Because that's what's really going on. In the logic of Matthew's gospel, Jesus' mother had virginally conceived her son. So there's something wrong here. She knew of an angelic message that he would save his people from their sins. She had seen how God protected him from the wicked king and had planned geographically his destiny, bringing him to Nazareth. She could scarcely show such misunderstanding of his mission to think that he was beside himself. So yes, to attribute this to her the way it reads, it said his family were there and they were trying to restrain him, and they thought he had gone mad, that he was beside himself. So they're saying this doesn't fit. There's a mismatch. And instead of thinking there's a textual corruption, they don't know what to think. They just make a comparison. They say, thus the Matthean scene involving the true family of Jesus is much milder in its totality than is the Marcan scene, and much less likely to be read as a replacement or rejection of the physical family. They're just simply saying, I think what they're trying to say is the more true representation of the family isn't what Mark's writing, but what Matthew's writing. So they're trying to say, we prefer Matthew. The truth is they're totally diametrically opposed to each other. And we know independently that Luke has the same account as Mark, because we know that Tertullian is quoting and referring to the same type of scene that is in Mark and at 3 verse 21. And Matthew also had it initially, obviously, as well. And both Luke and Matthew have it excised because it's inconsistent with the virgin birth account. And so it's by putting in something that didn't make sense, they had to take out something else. So that leaves you Mark 3, chapter 3, verse 21 as a conflict that you have to resolve. And just saying, I think Matthew's more true and the other isn't true, is to really say Mark's lying, but you don't know why. Why would he lie? He doesn't have any reason to make Mary look bad, right? So why would he do that? And it makes Jesus look more human. And that's why Tertullian is saying that makes him look more human. And Mark has no virgin birth account. So that's just another strike against the whole argument. So I'm going to stop this one, and we'll come back to another spot in the book. Okay, so now we're going to see a very, very subtle but very obvious corruption. So Matthew is what is up on the screen, our current Matthew. And this is chapter 12, begins at verse 50, but it gets into it at verse 53. And this is from the book at page 100, that book about basically the current view of Mary. And so this is how it reads. And then we're going to see how Mark reads. And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and coming to his own country, basically the area of Nazareth, he taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the son of the carpenter? Is not his mother called Mary? Are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where did this man get all this? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and in his own house, and he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Now imagine this is post virgin birth being added, and you are the editor looking at Mark, all the same words I'm going to show you now are in Mark, and ask yourself, what words do you have to take out to preserve a virgin birth that you now are inserting in Matthew? You've got to eliminate a couple of words. Would you do the same thing? That obviously is the difference. So the difference between the two accounts. So let's look at it. It's easier to show you. There are two differences, however, that are significant for Mariology. In 6 verse 4, Mark wrote, quote, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and among his own relatives and in his own house. So what was deleted is and among his own relatives. So Jesus, in context, in Mark 6 verse 4, has said something significant that would impair basically he could be referring back to what happened in chapter 3. So that seems to be why Jesus is saying this. So you don't have honor among your own relatives. That's what we saw happening 3 chapters earlier. But that's gone in Matthew. So anyway, the idea that Jesus' own relatives did not honor him is consonant with Mark's report that his own thought he was beside himself. That's in Mark 3, verse 21. Since Matthew has omitted the earlier reference, it is not surprising to find him omitting Jesus' relatives from the list of those who do not honor him. Once again, it would be difficult to imagine, this is key, that a mother who had conceived Jesus through the Holy Spirit would not honor him. Okay, so he's saying Matthew in fact, this is admitting it. Because of the virgin birth, he's not going to follow Mark because of the virgin birth. But is it Matthew? No, it's somebody who put in the virgin birth account way late. He has to remove the words among his own relatives, or otherwise it's going to look like Jesus doesn't. It's going to help support the idea, the dishonor that Mary and the family had gotten earlier was being repeated here by Jesus, that your own family will turn against you and they won't support you. So that's a very subtle thing, but you can see it's definitely to try to stay consistent with that's not going to happen in this family. So why would Jesus talk about it? So Jesus can't mean that he could have any conflict with his own relatives. So that's just going to be erased. Okay, and so this same book at page 119, footnote 258, is going to make a very revealing remark, and it's going to mention this work by R. Laurentin. I don't know how to say it in French. Jesus au Temple is written in relation to the thesis that Mary knew Jesus' divinity from the time of Annunciation. Okay, so what would you do if you had these Marcan passages? So he actually says, unless one supposes that Mary hid this insight from Jesus' followers, such a foreknowledge of his divinity renders unintelligible the long struggle toward the truth even after the resurrection. So now think about this. If she really had all these experiences, you would have to believe she's keeping it a secret from the brothers and sisters of Jesus, right? And she herself isn't incorporated it emotionally inside of her, if Mark's true. In fact, listen to the last sentence. The Marcan portrayal of the messianic secret and the Marcan portrayal of Mary as not understanding would then become great distortions. So in other words, Mark is a now he's looking at it. Mark is a distortion away from what the virgin birth having an annunciation where she has some understanding that she's been picked specially to be the host of God Almighty in her flesh. I mean, not in her flesh, but through her union with God somehow, she's going to give birth without a male being involved, and it will be Jesus. So that tells you these authors, this 4 or 5 authors are all in agreement that the Markan passage is contrary to the virgin birth account. Yet we saw that it was in Luke as late as the 207 period, because that's what's still going on in Luke when Tertullian is arguing with Marcion, saying, hey, Jesus is not God from birth. Jesus is not an angel from birth. He's a true human being. And here's an example. His own family is in conflict with him. They're not attached to him. We are to understand they think something's wrong with him. So this is Tertullian writing, and he's not writing in reference to Mark, because Marcion, we know, only will respect anything quoted out of Luke. If you try to quote something out of Mark, that's not important to him. He doesn't respect that gospel. He only respects Luke. So we know it's both in Mark and in Luke as late as 207 AD. That means the corruption that's happened has happened somewhere later. So it has not hit the presses. In other words, it could have been done secretly in some small areas, but has not yet pervaded. And Tertullian doesn't know of any version of Luke that has a virgin birth account, and clearly he doesn't see one that has an account where Mary and the brothers all think Jesus are trying to get him and stop him because they think he's lost it. Okay. So again, this is a decisive proof that the virgin birth account was not in existence for the first 200 years, 180 years, 160 to 200 years. In the first 160 to 200 years, there was no virgin birth account. And I'm going to see if there's any more I need. Guys point out that Luke does not clearly depict Mary as, how can I put it, she's told that she will have the child by the Spirit, but there's another example where it says, there's a reference to Paul says this, that Isaac was born according to the Spirit. So was he born of a virgin? So as these authors say, that didn't imply that Isaac didn't have a human father. So there was something not completely expressed in Luke that is expressed only in Matthew, which is it's going to be a virgin birth, because he's the one who goes to all the virgin quote of Isaiah 7:14. So you don't have the clear reference to a virgin birth in Luke. And so just so you know, this task force came to this conclusion that Luke doesn't clearly say it. It's only in Matthew. So listen to that. This is another thing you don't really hear unless you are paying close attention to the differences. So the majority of the task force was persuaded, however, that Luke really assumed and intended to describe a virginal conception, even though he did not make this point so clearly as did Matthew. In reaching this conclusion, we did not use Matthew to interpret Luke, but drew upon the structure and pattern of the Lucan infancy narrative. All right. So anyway, that'll end this. And so I guess the point here is that the virgin birth account is not original. And my theory still is that Marcion made the account of Matthew, not Luke, and he made it with the help of Theodotion. And this would be probably in the middle of the century, in the 150, 160 period. And it's not circulated completely yet. They haven't tried to swarm the world with this copy yet. They will. And then when that comes out and becomes known, then the church fights back and issues the Luke version. And the reason they're doing that, and if you know it, it's a lot more flowery and more positive about Jesus than in the Matthew version. But the solution they were trying to offer is to get Jesus to have a Davidic line that wasn't blocked by Jaconia, and that's why they did that. So Luke's revisions was done with a true pious purpose or a true Christian purpose, even though you should never do something like that. But they were trying to help Christianity. But the people who changed Matthew were trying to destroy Christianity, stop Jesus from being Messiah, because Marcion doesn't believe Jesus is Messiah, throw Jaconia in there and cut off Joseph completely. And I believe it was originally intended in Luke that Joseph would beget Jesus for a very good reason, because that was the whole purpose of putting in the second account. But later, the Roman Catholic Church decided we can't have that. They have to read one way or the other, and we're going to have them both read that it's no Davidic heir comes from Joseph. That's it. And we'll just deal with the repercussions of that. Maybe Gentiles, they don't care. And you know what? It seems to me a lot of Gentiles don't care, but Jews do. And as long as there's a significant segment of this world that this makes a big difference to, then we need to address this and confront our and frankly, it's just not true. I mean, you can't leave a lie out there that denies Jesus is the Messiah. I mean, you can say he's Messiah all day long, but if you don't defend Jesus' true honor by saying, okay, I support the movement to fix the Bibles and take out the virgin birth account and put Joseph beside Jesus, because that's what it said in the oldest Bible we found. And one thing more I wanted to tell you, I would like to do one last thing to show you that of all the manuscripts we have, there's no reason why there's such a huge gap between the early first century and all the way up to the Roman Catholic Church in the 320, 340s, because every manuscript of any decent quality is gone. You've got scraps and pieces of paper, no doubt about it, but you don't have anything that is anywhere comprehensive until you see the Sinai Sinaiticus come out of the desert and by that lady who found it. So how do people explain that there could be no copies of one of the most important persons of history, or wasn't it that they deliberately went out and destroyed them all because they reflected particularly the contrary version to what they wanted us to believe now? So if you destroy all the prior copies of all the Bibles, then you just throw them in the trash one after the other, and you just start over, and we're just going to make more copies. This is Constantine. He has the bucks. He's going to make it work. We'll do Latin. We'll do Greek. We'll repaper the world, because these people were adamant that doctrine came before decency, and they were sacrilegious. They didn't care about destroying holy documents. They believed winning is everything, and they ended up basically destroying the most important works ever of history. All right, God bless. Take care, everybody. Ciao. Good night.